Hello friends! Here's the last video about how to make this spooky fall dress using Vogue 9076. In the last video we got our bodice mostly done and got the sleeves finished and set in, so now let's get into the pockets and the skirt. First I'll stay stitch the pocket opening on the skirt, so I'm just sewing it about 3/8 inch from the waist to the hip. Now I can pin this to the pocket bag lining and sew them together. Trim the lining seam allowance down to about 3/8 inch and snip into the curve of both seam allowances. Then flip them right side out and press with the skirt fabric rolled over just a little bit. Put the pocket bag facing on top and pin the edges of the pocket bags together. Then serge the edge to finish it. Lay the skirt panels back out and pin the side seams and waist through the pocket bags. Then sew them in place at 3/8 inch. On the waist, only sew about 1/2 inch at the opening, don't sew the rest of the bag to the waist yet. Grab the back skirt panels and pin them together at center back. Sew at 1/2 inch from the hem to the waist, then press the seam open. Pin the back skirt and front skirts together at the side seam. Sew at 1/2 inch from the hem to the waist. The pocket won't want to be pressed open, so instead of fighting with it, I'm going to press the seam toward the back. To prepare the front waist closure, there's a little bit of fiddly work to be done. I'm going to cut interfacing for the front flaps that extend 1/2 inch past center front and fuse that on both sides. The right side, which is the side with the loops, needs to be trimmed back 1.5 inches. Then fold back 1/2 inch and press. Then sew that down. Fold the top over at center front and sew just the top edge down. The left side needs a little more work because I want this to be clean finished where there's lining. Fold the edge back 1/2 inch and press. Sew it down at the edge. Then fold the skirt back at the fold line. It should be 1.5 inches from the center front mark. Sew the top at 1/2 inch, just up to the center front notch. Snip the seam allowance up to the stitch line so you can turn it right side out. Now it has a clean edge to butt up to the extension piece later. Sew the gathering stitches on the skirt from center front to the pocket edge. I increased the size of my back skirt pieces, so I'm going to have a gathering stitch on the back too. Pin the skirt to the bodice, matching the side seams. The right front skirt edge is already finished, so it should be pinned right at the center front line of the bodice, which is 1/2 inch from the edge. Pull the bobbin thread of the gathering stitch to form the skirt gathers. Spread them evenly and pin to the bodice. Pin the pocket bags over the gathers once they're looking good. When you're ready, sew at 1/2 inch. Press the seam allowance and then remove the gathering stitch. Run it through a serger to clean the edge. Now line up the fronts of the skirts and pin. Sew from the bottom up and around this corner. Press the seam open. At the corner, snip into just the left seam allowance so that the extension part can fold under the right side like this. Press the center front flat at the extension and make sure the waistband pieces line up. Back at the bodice, I'm pinning the collar on, matching notches, shoulder seams, and center back. Sew at a 1/2 inch, then snip the curves of the bodice neck. Press open. I decided to add in the little ties at the neck, so I have this little black ribbon and I'm using a metallic ribbon to finish the ends so they don't fray. I had matching metallic thread and I'm hand sewing the gold ribbon pieces onto the bottom of the black ribbon. Then I turned the edges in and hand sewed them down. Then I folded it in half and hand sewed along the edges. I pinned them right under the collar and shortened my stitch length to about 1.5 millimeters to sew them in place. Now back to the poor neglected lining pieces. Line up the waistband piece at the front yoke. Mark the 1/2 inch seam allowance and line up the stitch edge. Mark where the yoke piece ends and then mark in a 1/2 inch. This is where you should stop sewing so the yoke edge can turn back later. Press open. Pin the collar to the lining and sew, snip, and press open like we did on the bodice. Now at the corner of the yoke lining, mark the stitch line at a 1/2 inch. Use a small stitch length, I'm using 1.5 millimeters, and sew about 1 inch on either side of the corner to stabilize it. Then snip into the corner right up to, but not through, the stitching. Press the seam allowances back at the back yoke, front yoke, and down the corner. And at the waistband pieces. Trim away any pesky seam allowances as you're pressing. The outer edge will get sewn right onto the garment, so line up the seams and notches and start pinning. Keep in mind that the serged edges might have been trimmed, so use the stitch line as a guide to line up the seam allowances. Now sew the entire perimeter at a 1/2 inch. At the corners, shorten your stitch length for about 1 inch on either side of the point, and be sure to check that you're not sewing over the skirt or extension pieces, especially in the left corner. There's a lot crammed in there. When everything's good and sewn, snip away the corners to within 1/8 of the seam. Grade the collar lining at the curve and snip little V's out of the rest of the seam allowance so it can turn back smoothly. I'm going to understitch this outer edge as far as I can, so I'm just folding the lining over the seam allowance and stitching near the seam. I also understitched at the waist seam. Then turn it right side out and press the edges flat. I'm pinning along the collar seam so I can hand sew the seam allowances together here. You can do this with your machine, or you can even stitch in the ditch from the outside of the dress. Now take the lining at the shoulder and kind of pull it under itself to pin it to the dress right at the yoke seam edge. Continue pulling the shoulder through and pin at the shoulder seam and other edge of the yoke. Sew them together using the sleeve seam as a guide. If you serged it like I did, you might have to stagger the edges to account for the bit cut off during serging. Fold the shoulder back, and now we can pin the lining all the rest of the way around. Now get a needle, thread, and a thimble and go to town. I have to confess, this is one of my favorite parts of sewing. Just put on some nice relaxing black metal and get in the zone. Give all of the collar, yoke, and waistband parts one more good press, and then we'll finish up the closure at the front. First, hand sew the left front extension to the extension on the skirt. Spread the dress out with the front butted together and mark the button placement through the loops. Sew the buttons in place. I like to put the knot of the thread on the front of the garment so it's hidden under the button and it doesn't rub against my skin. I stitch the button down 3 times, then knot the thread twice. I get my snaps in bulk. These are size 1, and I also like size 3 for larger areas. This pack is a gross, which is 144 pieces. Personally, snaps on cards really stress me out. There's something very calming about having this many snaps at my disposal. I'm going to put the male snaps on the right so it's flat against the garment. I'm also going to put a few snaps behind the buttons so they don't pop open on accident. Only sew through the lining and fold over parts. Don't sew it through this outer layer of fabric. Here's a trick for placement. Rub the side of your chalk over the snap so it has a powdery layer. Then carefully place it exactly where you want it to be on the other side of the fabric. Press the snaps into the fabric and the chalk should leave little marks exactly where the partners need to go. These can be sewn through all layers. All that's left to do is the hem. Since I did a contrast fabric on this dress, it's looking a little top heavy. I have just enough skull fabric left to do a little band at the hem that should tie the skirt into the rest of the dress. So I cut my fabric into 2 3/4 inch strips, and the same out of my lining fabric because there wasn't enough of the skulls to fold it over. I joined the ends to make one long piece, and now I'm sewing the skulls and lining together. Then understitch and press with the lining folded under. I'm pressing the top of the lining down a 1/2 inch because I'll hand sew this just like I did with the bodice lining. The skirt length is perfect the way it is, so I'm going to cut it back so that this band will fall at the same place. I'm marking 2 inches out on the skirt hem, then cutting it away. Lay the skirt out so it's smooth but not stretched. Then pin the band along the hem starting at center back with a little bit hanging past for seam allowance later. Once you've pinned around the circumference and you're back at the center back, mark on both ends of the band right where the center back seam is. Then mark out from there a 1/2 inch and cut away the excess. Sew the ends together and press open. Cut away the seam allowances inside. Then finish pinning it to the hem. Sew at a 1/2 inch. I want to press the seam allowance down, but the band doesn't want to fold right at the sew line. So I'm pressing the seam open first. This way the skull fabric is folded exactly at the stitch. Then I can fold the skirt seam allowance down over it and press it all down. Pin the band lining up over the seam and then sew it in place just like the bodice lining. Give it one more good press and it's done. The band at the bottom does stiffen the hem and make it flare out a bit, but I think the pop of color down there is worth it. Overall, I love this pattern. I loved the look of it from the start, and the fit was perfect. I'm glad I lengthened the sleeves a little bit and tightened the cuff so that the sleeves bliss on a little bit. I'm also glad I added pockets. Thank you for watching, and I hope you give this pattern a try. If you've enjoyed these videos, please give them a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Up next, I'm going to do another everyday spooky garment, but this time you get to make the pattern.